where many of them proceeded to be imprisoned or killed by the Bolsheviks. And subsequent, so after that, in the 1930s, what you get is, to try and keep anything like that from ever arising again. And after a series of general strikes, actually, like citywide general strikes, which were causing the political classes a great deal of fear because workers just weren't showing up for work. They put through the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, which created this system of recognition. And the way the system of recognition worked was if you behaved according to the standards the government set down, they'd give you certain privileges, right? They'd force employers to come to the table with you. They'd sort of benefit you in negotiations once you already had a union organized. But if you look at what they did, they sort of went down the list of every labor tactic that was effective in the 1930s and the 1920s and 19-teens. General strikes, secondary boycotts, sit-down strikes, all these other tactics that had been used to withdraw labor power.
Yeah, and Carson brings all that up in Theories on
That's right.
Capital.
Yeah, and so Kevin Carson has a lot of good material on the background of this, also in Ethics of Labor Struggle.
Yeah, I read that too.
Yeah, so basically what happened is you created a structure in which you benefited a select class of union bosses who were sort of in control of the bureaucratic mechanisms, but that actually made it very difficult for rank and file workers to organize wildcat unions that could actually accomplish what they were trying to accomplish. And my view is that if you got rid of Taft-Hartley, and if you got rid of Wagner, and if you got rid of all the laws, both those that are supposed to benefit labor and those that are supposed to hurt it, that would actually substantially improve the position of radical workers who are working to provide alternatives to the economic status quo, rather than just getting sort of a wider slice of the pie within the economic status quo. And so you'd actually see a lot of resurgence of the labor movement and a more effective labor movement if they were, if you're sort of allowed to use the full range of free market organizing tactics.
Okay.
Yeah, Darian.
You had mentioned a little bit about how in corporate capitalism, a lot of people are dissatisfied with their economic situation.
Yes.
They're renting out their labor to a boss. And I'd just like to hear a little bit about how you think this might be subsidized by the state, or the state distorts the market so that more egalitarian, more working for yourself, or more, or less alienating, I guess you could put it, methods of meeting your economic needs are they can't compete as well as they normally would.
Sure. Part of this is just to recur back to the four old monopolies and the four new ones and all the other forms of economic intervention that is going on. To get down to specifics a bit more, so the importance of I think that the importance of the land monopoly and of the way the money monopoly works to restrict the range of available options and so forth all helps determine the basic problem with sort of wage employment. It's not that wage employment itself is a problem. What's a problem is a system in which wage employment predominates because there aren't any easily accessible alternatives, in which people are sort of pushed into wage employment on the basis of sort of dependency and sort of being in a very precarious position economically, versus a system in which people might choose that as the best way of making a living, given their available options. And so like the land monopoly in particular, because it works through, so government owns a very large percentage of the land that's out there. The land that they don't claim ownership over, they're happy to seize through eminent domain. And that when government starts handing out land, it's handed out to a very select class of politically favored developers and landlords, right? So in Las Vegas, for example, the typical contract for getting some, there's tons of empty land all around Las Vegas. And there's tons of homeless people in Las Vegas who would very much like a place to live. And so if you simply left them free, land that's not currently owned and not currently being used, to go and set up their own houses, you'd have an immediate radical change to the situation faced by people as far as finding a place to live goes. And yet, the federal government has roped off all that land and said, ours, not because they worked it, not because they did anything to earn it, but just because they're the government and they say so. Now it gets filtered down to county and local government, and how do they get it out there onto the market? Well, they get it out there by signing these giant contracts with giant development corporations and nobody else. A typical development contract in Las Vegas is for a planned community that has, up in the tens of thousands of homes, and often involves the transfer of about $500 million from the development corporation into the local government. As a direct result of that, ordinary people have extremely restricted access to available land, which they would not have in a free society where government is not monopolizing access to land. Now, as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of a number of other things, rigged markets where government forces you to pay for additional expenses, like car insurance, a particular way of wiring up your house, a particular way of doing the plumbing in your house, sort of systematically ratchets up fixed costs, right? That makes you more and more dependent on the cash economy, just in order to be able to get by from week to week without losing, without losing the place where you live, without losing the food that you need to eat. And so this artificially tends to drive people into sort of labor for cash returns in particular, and especially labor for a boss in a wage-paying relationship, because a lot of the independent alternatives are being shut out through government regulatory cartels, through government criminalization of victimless crime businesses, through government licensure schemes that require you to pay ridiculous amounts of money and spend ridiculous amounts of time just getting certified to do something very simple you could have done out of your apartment without their approval. And so it sort of systematically rigs these extremely unfavorable terms on which people who, especially people who are poor and don't have sort of a cushion of savings to fall back on, have to sort of keep going into the labor market on these extremely skewed terms in such a way that it creates these very precarious, sort of paycheck to paycheck situations, and sort of constructs the basic predicament faced by most people finding themselves falling into poverty because of the lack of grassroots alternatives, because of the lack of channels for their own entrepreneurship, and because of the government efforts to squash and criminalize and burn everything that they try to do to make a living for themselves.
And that sort of comment about wage slavery, just really fast, that wage slavery was brought up by Brad Spangler on his blog. By a deeper analysis of it, a left libertarian analysis of it, reveals that wage slavery takes place in the market, but the causation is the state, not the market itself.
That's right, because it's a rigged market.
Yeah.
Right. We're not talking about the results of a free market when we talk about the fact that people are poor and fetched up on the skids and so forth. Yeah. It's because we're talking about a market in which a select class of people has been artificially given control over all the key resources in the economy, and that pervades the entire economy, because everybody's got to find a place to live, everybody's got to make a living. But when you do this, time after time, you just keep running into the state. Yeah.
We'll break out for lunch.
Okay. Yeah. So let's all get some lunch, and thank you all very much. And I'd be happy to talk about